we'd like to proceed to the second presentation after the great Andrew's very first presentation. So unfortunately, Christian Goethers has got something back home, so he can't make it today, unfortunately. However, our very Dan Prokop has agreed to step in, and he's going to continue the topic related to university and ecosystem, I understand. So floor is yours, Dan.
Thank you. So I'm kind of going to take this university topic a bit further and into a slightly different angle. I'm going to explore the configurations of specifically university entrepreneurial ecosystems. And this is a kind of empirical work that tries to show how these configurations look like. And what I focus on in terms of my research question is why do university entrepreneurial ecosystem outcomes differ across universities? And I'm focusing here on 4 illustrative UK-based university entrepreneurial ecosystems. And university entrepreneurial ecosystems are related to these commercialization outcomes related to spin-off companies, creating spin-off companies. And in terms of the outcomes that I look at is, I focus on spin-off company formation and spin-off company survival. So on a longer stage of that. Now, for those in the audience who don't know what spin-off companies are, the university spin-off companies are companies based on intellectual property generated by the universities and are typically founded by the universities. There are some minor variations across different countries, but in the UK, these companies are set up by the universities. Now, a little bit of background. Obviously, Andrew said quite a bit in terms of the literature behind it, but the universities are considered very central actors in the systems. However, I see the entrepreneurial ecosystem concept as enabling that departure from the heavy focus on the universities and actually focus more on the entrepreneurs and the actors within the ecosystem. Obviously, there is kind of critical debates about the boundaries of the ecosystems. At what spatial scale should we be looking at them, and of relational scale, and so on. And together with Fumi and Ben, we had quite a few conversations about that in Glasgow and Tokyo in the past 2 years, actually. Time flies. And what I'm trying to employ here is I'm looking through the framework suggested by Ben Spiegel. I'm looking in particular at these social attributes of the ecosystem, and specifically I'm trying to explore the variable configurations of university entrepreneurial ecosystems, specifically looking at these outcomes in terms of spin-off company formation and survival. Why does it matter? Because if we look at the policymakers and what they do, usually they try to measure particular outcomes, or they try to impose particular outcomes on particular locations or local governments and so on. And it's important for us to understand that if we follow a particular outcome, it may lead to a different configuration of an ecosystem. As a result, we may be getting desirable or undesirable outcomes. So I'm trying to study how these configurations look like actually in reality. And I focus on university entrepreneurial ecosystems. I focus very narrowly on academic spin-off formation and survival. It's not the only commercialization channel that universities use. There are licensing agreements, there's contract research consultancy, and so on, but it's just very difficult to focus on so many. In terms of the UK context and academic spin-off company activity, UK does quite well in terms of on the international scale. It forms quite a lot of spin-off companies. It's reasonably decent in terms of sustaining their existence. You can see the regional kind of spread of the active spin-off companies across the UK, and The one thing that is problematic, obviously, is that the typical kind of explanations stemming from just looking at regional distribution and regional economic performance doesn't really allow us a very good insight into understanding where this, where these outcomes come from. So if we look at London, London is actually not the region where most of the active spin-off companies are. It's Scotland. And Scotland is not really the expected region for that. And at the same time, there is a lot of intra-regional variation between different university entrepreneurial ecosystems and how they perform in terms of these outcomes. And we can look at an example of Birmingham, and we have Aston University based there and the University of Birmingham, and they perform completely differently, even though both are research-intensive universities that generate sufficient levels of intellectual property to actually commercialize it. But the outcomes aren't exactly the same. So there's something more in the matter that we need to inspect. So this work is qualitative in nature. I did some interviews across 4 different university entrepreneurial ecosystems with technology transfer offices, business incubators, investors, and spin-off companies with academic founders and entrepreneurs there. Altogether, I conducted 15 interviews, and I'm using the inductive analytical approach here. Now, my sampling here is extreme cases purposeful sampling, which maximizes the variation in the data gathered. So it offers a kind of a very rich kind of insight into what's going on, into trying to explain where these outcomes come from, and trying to have some kind of a look at those configurations of the ecosystems. And the way I structured my criteria for sample selection is I'm looking at the spin-off generation and spin-off survival outcomes. I'm looking at the low spin-off generation and the high spin-off generation across particular university entrepreneurial ecosystems. And the same thing goes for the spin-off survival. So which university entrepreneurial ecosystem produced spin-off companies that are characterized by higher survival rates or lower survival rates. So in a way, extreme cases in this that I'm looking at. This is all the information about, across the illustrative cases. I'm not going to go through that because there's just no time. But I would love to go through it if someone wants to contact me later on to discuss it. Now, through the inductive analysis, I have extracted 3 key themes that explain where these outcomes are coming from. And the first one is called connectedness, and that relates to the network. The second one is called filtration, and this relates to the evaluation and selection of entrepreneurial opportunities. And the other one is geography. Hopefully, unsurprisingly, the spatial things, they matter, the spatial aspects. And the spatial aspects present themselves across the connectedness and filtration dimensions. And we'll talk about them in a moment. This is how they kind of look like across these different university entrepreneurial ecosystems. And as an example, for example, in the Scottish University Entrepreneurial Ecosystem, we see the connectedness dimension being characterized by poor networks of the technology transfer team, the external entrepreneur being recruited by the technology transfer office, and then being completely relied on in terms of developing the networking for the spin-off company. So the external entrepreneur becomes kind of the central actor in the network within the Scottish University Entrepreneurial Ecosystem. Now, there's a completely different story when we look at the London University Entrepreneurial Ecosystem. And obviously, these aren't regional ecosystems. These are just the nicknames that I gave to particular universities simply because I needed to anonymize them so that they could share more information with me. And in terms of the London University Entrepreneurial Ecosystem, the Technology Transfer Office has a very diverse and broad network. And it's not just with different entrepreneurs, it's also a network with venture capitalists. And the Technology Transfer Office works with a partner venture capital office. Okay, so it has a very strong connection to one venture capitalist that comes in and pre-selects some of those disclosures for commercialization later on. And then the networks are also brought in from the academic founder and the external entrepreneur recruited to the management team. So the networks come from all different kinds of sources. It's not just relied on one actor, which is very interesting. And then in terms of filtration, when we look at the Welsh University Entrepreneurial Ecosystem, there's a very selective technology transfer office that works with a specialist venture capital partner, which participates in early pre-selection of disclosures. And then the Technology Transfer Office, from whatever remains in terms of the disclosures, they select further kind of potential spin-out company opportunities from that. And then this highly selective specialist VC further selects from those kind of companies that they want to develop. And this is some representative quotes, and I will only read one of them that captures this filtration and what the investors do in terms of spin-off companies. So when we first have an idea, we put in probably between 50,000 to 250,000, and you're actually trying to make them fail. You want them to fail. If they're a bad idea, fail early, fail cheaply, fail professionally. When you're starting these companies, you're probably on a 15-year journey, so you don't want to spend a lot of time on one that's not going to work. So this kind of depicts this filtration, this heavy level of filtration that is going on at the venture capital stage, but it also goes throughout the whole life cycle of the company, because once it generates, once it raises venture capital funding, there are different rounds throughout which the company is going to be selected and evaluated for investment. And later on, when the company starts selling their products, it's going to be evaluated and selected by the market of consumers. So this filtration is a longer stage process where the company is constantly filtered in the ecosystem in terms of its successful outcomes, whether it should actually progress further. So when we actually start depicting this, these outcomes in terms of spin-off formation rate and spin-off survival rate, and when we try to picture where these dimensions can be placed on this diagram, we can see that there are particular configurations of these entrepreneurial ecosystems emerging from that. And there are configurations that are geared towards just forming higher numbers of spin-off companies. There are configurations that are geared towards just this higher level of survival rate of those spin-off companies, so focus on their long-term success. And there are some kind of hybrid configurations of the entrepreneurial ecosystem actors. In the case of the example of the Scottish University Entrepreneurial Ecosystem, that university ecosystem has porous filtration, so it doesn't select very well those disclosures to create spin-off companies. It's not very well connected, and its connections, its networks are mostly of a regional and national level, but there's very little, if anything, going on locally. Mostly because that particular university entrepreneurial ecosystem is based in a remote Scottish location. So hopefully this kind of enables us to depict these different configurations across these four examples. Now, I don't present this as fixed binary kind of configurations. You know, this is, you know, one configuration, second, third, and fourth. The way I look at it it's a spectrum of configurations that, you know, are they university entrepreneurial ecosystems, maybe somewhere in the middle between all these kind of, all these dimensions. So to conclude, I think I will just jump towards some policy recommendations. If we have any policymakers in the audience, one thing that I would like policymakers to remember from that is that they need to be aware in terms of setting up particular outcomes for their policies, for strategies. They need to be very careful about that, what they want to achieve. Because once they do that, and once all the machinery kicks in terms of stimulating development of that particular policy in practice, then the ecosystem may become set up in a particular configuration that may be difficult to change if we actually desire a different outcome. Okay, so these outcomes are very clearly related to the configurations of the ecosystems. And now one last thing kind of to mention is that obviously universities have a far wider channel of forming commercialization activity. This is just a very narrow take that I could have taken in this particular research. So thank you. I know I'm running out of time. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Dan. Bang on time. Thanks very much for stepping in with such a great presentation. So I think probably there are quite a few people who are very interested in topic who'd like to start. Yep. So I see Aaron putting hands up. So would you like to start, please?
Yes, hi. I just have one question. It's regard to what you said about this VC in London, and how does it work, right? Because the VCs obviously should not be too close to the universities, because then we have some kind of competition problem and so on. And if there's one special VC that selects people beforehand, like how is this handled in terms of governance? That's what I'm wondering, because obviously it's nice when they're close, but I guess they should be at arm's length.
Thank you, Aaron. The way it works is universities sign a contract with venture capitalists, and these particular universities that have, and there are I think over 20 universities in the UK that have a deal with one particular venture capitalist, is that they get a stake in the outcomes from selling those companies later on in the future. But as I mentioned, this is potentially a 15-year journey, so it's a long-term thing for them. But these deals are there, and funnily enough, these venture capitalists just come in and they look at all the disclosures that the universities have. They cherry pick whatever they like, and they go off and set it up, in terms of all the support, the management team, and so on. I know it's a bit, there's loads of critical issues that we could discuss about that. But this is just the way it happens, and it makes things work in terms of successfully commercializing particular intellectual property. But those universities, after the venture capital selects whatever they like, they also select themselves from whatever that remains, and they commercialize that as well. I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's just the way it works.
It's super interesting. I had never heard about this. I mean, we here in Germany have a huge problem with commercialization of science, so maybe this is an approach that works.
Thank you.
Okay, I see Dina putting hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, hi, Dr. Fumi. I'm happy to be here with you, actually. I would like just to reflect on something that Aaron has just said about the role of venture capitalists within the system. Well, actually, to be honest, I'm studying digital entrepreneurship ecosystems in emerging markets. And to my surprise, and perhaps to add to his surprise, that entrepreneurs themselves and venture capitalists were the true actors of the system, not universities, because in emerging markets, there's low educational levels. So venture capitalists are the bearers of knowledge. They provide information, they provide money. So they create this buzz that all of you want within the ecosystem. And for me, I think they're much more important than universities, because universities don't change their institutions, but they're large institutions, very old. Venture capitalists are people who are knowledge bearers. They can give information for free and invest. So I think the role of venture capitalists within the ecosystem has to be much more highlighted. especially if they have mentors and blockbusters entrepreneurs. I am with this paper, to be honest, that there are other actors within the ecosystem rather than universities. And thank you, Dr. Fumi, so much for planning this. Thank you so much. This is what I wanted to say.
Right, thank you, Dina.
Thank you.
And it's a good point, and I see some, people putting some up. Respond.
I completely agree with you that venture capitalists play a very important role in the ecosystems, and I'm sure that there is a very varied input that they have across different types of economies. But we also need to notice that we're not just talking about the capital cities that usually have the concentration of venture capitalists, but there are also a lot of entrepreneurial ecosystems that do not have any locally available venture capitalists at all. And there, perhaps the universities may be playing a more important role in terms of stimulating some activity. But again, that's something we could debate a lot further. Thank you.
Hey, any other questions? I'm just trying to see if there's any hands up. Okay, so just sort of, I've got some sort of question, probably not that clearly formulated, but in terms of your policy recommendations, it's quite tough one, isn't it? So what could the universities do in terms of given all this configuration and environment, which may not be that quick to change in terms of incentivization or in terms of attracting business? Do you have any sort of recommendation or suggestions?
Yes, for me, thank you. First of all, I think the universities need to observe what they are actually good at, because not all universities are good at creating spin-off companies. Many universities are specialized in different commercialization channels and in different activities. I think they should recognize their strengths, what they can actually do. And as a result, they should also look at their strengths and where they should actually support activities within universities. There's one thing that emerged from my studies, basically in the entrepreneurial ecosystems that had weaker outcomes. What happened was there was very little support for generating those outcomes. Okay, so instead of a technology transfer office that is staffed with 15 people, and the weaker university entrepreneurial ecosystem had a technology transfer office staffed with 2. And that kind of makes it very difficult for them to actually evaluate all the disclosures coming up from a university. And then to engage in different commercialization channels and with different actors, build networks and so on. It's just becoming very difficult. It's a bottleneck, pretty much. So recognizing the strengths and diverting resources if they really want to engage in those aspects.
So just sort of trying to see, anyone has got questions or any sort of suggestions, or anyone sort of doing something similar who wants to sort of say something? I think there were some sort of comments early on, and this kind of relates back to what Andrew was sort of talking about. So yeah, I think Katrina mentioned something interesting in the building ecosystem and sort of the influence of universities. Would you like to say something about it? Does it kind of relates to kind of startups kind of configuration issues, or anything you want to throw in?
So if you're interested, I can share some insights from the Berlin ecosystem that kind of relate to this university debate. So what I see in Berlin is that, interestingly, the ecosystem is somehow divided into different subsystems, where the universities who actually generate IP and spin-offs are somehow embedded in their own subsystem. And then we have this more private, economically driven subsystem. And there's also one very important university who feeds into this subsystem, but this one is actually not located in Berlin, but in Wallenda. So it's quite far away, actually. So you have this private business school somewhere in the west of Germany, where a lot of entrepreneurs learn how to found a business and where they build their networks. and then they all come to Berlin, and then they can feed from their personal networks that they actually created while studying 500 kilometers abroad. So I think it's quite particular, maybe quite a unique configuration, but I wanted to underscore that this role of universities might actually vary significantly across entrepreneurial ecosystems.
Thank you, Katharina. That's really interesting, actually, and quite unusual in many ways. Shall we call a break?